Friends, thank you for being here today. Let us step into a hypothetical timeline to examine a scenario that poses a fundamental question. What if the legal wall finally breached the executive fortress? Picture a world where what just happened would have been unthinkable in American politics only a few years ago. In this projected scenario, within the last hour, a federal judge has effectively severed Donald Trump from the command center of the business empire that has defined his public identity for decades. At nearly the same moment, imagine that Warren Buffett, long famous for avoiding direct commentary on individual business figures, spoke with striking clarity about Trump, delivering remarks that reverberated across Wall Street and Washington alike. Taken together, in this dramatization, these events mark a turning point that extends far beyond one man's legal troubles. They cut directly to questions of power, accountability, and whether institutions can still restrain someone who has spent a lifetime testing their limits. Don't just watch passively. I need a consensus here. Do you believe our current institutions are strong enough to handle a stress test like this, or are they crumbling? Type strong or crumbling in the comments right now. Visualize a Manhattan court acting in coordination with federal authorities, issuing an emergency order that legal scholars are already describing as one of the most extraordinary corporate interventions ever imposed on a politically powerful figure. This was not a fine, a settlement, or the seizure of a single asset. The ruling stripped Trump of operational authority over the Trump Organization itself. Control has been transferred to a court-appointed receiver, ending Trump's ability to run, direct, or even freely access the company that bears his name. For a former president whose political persona is inseparable from his business mythology, the implications are enormous. To understand why this moment matters in our analysis, it is necessary to grasp what the Trump Organization represents in Trump's world. From his earliest real estate projects, the company has been more than a collection of properties. It has been his financial engine, his personal brand, and the foundation of his claim to expertise, success, and legitimacy. Since leaving the White House, Trump's relevance in national politics has rested almost entirely on the image of the billionaire dealmaker who understands wealth creation better than career politicians. The business was not separate from his politics. It funded it, symbolized it, and validated it. That foundation has now been shaken at its core. For roughly a year and a half, prosecutors have been assembling a case alleging systematic financial deception tied to how Trump and his organization valued properties. Court filings released in this timeline lay out a pattern in which assets were repeatedly assigned wildly different values, depending on the audience. When seeking loans, properties were described as worth billions. When reporting to tax authorities, those same properties were suddenly worth a fraction of that amount. Prosecutors argue this was not aggressive interpretation or creative accounting, but a coordinated, long-running scheme designed to deceive lenders and reduce tax obligations. Stop and think about that. If a small business owner did this, they'd be in handcuffs by dinner time. Is this a double standard or just smart business? Let me know your honest thoughts on justice versus power below. The inquiry began with a review of financial statements by New York authorities, but quickly expanded once federal investigators identified similar practices stretching back decades involving multiple properties and a range of financial institutions. What initially appeared to be a state-level civil matter evolved into a sweeping fraud investigation with national implications. Continuously following this narrative arc, the turning point arrived at 2:47 p.m. Eastern Time. This is when Judge Sandra Chen, appointed by a Republican administration and widely regarded as meticulous and unsentimental, issued the order removing Trump from control of his own company. The scope of the order is remarkable. Trump can no longer approve transactions, hire or fire executives, move money, or make strategic decisions. He cannot access corporate funds without oversight. He is barred from entering company offices without permission from the receiver. Federal monitors have already taken physical control of financial systems, servers, and records at Trump Tower. For a former president, there is no modern precedent for this level of judicial intervention. Financial analysts say the ruling exposes just how precarious Trump's position had become. Public reporting indicates that much of his wealth exists on paper, tied up in properties that are heavily leveraged or under legal threat. Liquid cash has reportedly fallen to levels unseen in years. Without command of the Trump Organization, Trump loses not only revenue streams, but the last tangible proof of the business prowess he has long claimed as his defining strength. The judge's written opinion leaves little ambiguity about her reasoning. She concluded that Trump engaged in a sustained pattern of fraudulent misrepresentation that harmed lenders and violated banking and tax laws. She wrote that his conduct demonstrated a deliberate disregard for legal and ethical constraints in pursuit of personal gain, and that allowing him to retain control posed an ongoing risk to creditors and the public. This was not a sealed or quietly issued ruling. It was filed publicly, and Judge Chen went a step further by scheduling a press conference, an extremely rare move that legal experts interpret as an effort to preempt claims of secrecy, bias, or persecution. Shortly after the order became public, imagine that Warren Buffett weighed in. The 94-year-old investor, renowned for his caution and restraint, delivered an unusually blunt assessment. He argued that organizations built on allegiance to a single individual rather than adherence to principles are structurally doomed. Drawing on decades of experience studying corporate failures, Buffett said the collapse now unfolding was not surprising, but inevitable. Confusing personal loyalty with ethical governance, he warned, always ends the same way. Buffett revealed that he had privately cautioned investors to steer clear of Trump-related ventures, noting that the underlying fundamentals were weak. This was not, he emphasized, a political judgment. It was a cultural one. In companies centered on ego and image rather than sound practices, losing the leader does not merely change management. It exposes the absence of a real business beneath the surface. Does Buffett's assessment ring true to you, or is he just another voice of the establishment trying to take down an outsider? I want to see a debate in the comments. Team Buffett or Team Trump? For someone who almost never comments on individual cases, the directness of Buffett's remarks was striking. People close to Buffett say his concern runs deeper than this single case. He has long worried about the signal sent when someone can operate deceptively for years while presenting himself as the embodiment of business success. One senior figure associated with Berkshire Hathaway described Trump's approach as a textbook example of modern capitalism's worst tendencies, valuing appearance over substance, loyalty over integrity, and brand over real economic value. This pattern of loyalty followed by abandonment is not new in Trump's orbit. Time and again, individuals who served him faithfully found themselves discarded the moment they became inconvenient. His first attorney general, Jeff Sessions, went from trusted ally to public enemy after recusing himself from the Russia investigation. Bill Barr, once viewed as Trump's ultimate legal defender, was cast aside after refusing to support false claims about the 2020 election. This brings us inevitably to examine the complex web of loyalty, betrayal, and broader political implications, starting with key figures. Mike Pence remained unwaveringly loyal for 4 years, only to be targeted when he upheld the Constitution on January 6th. Even Kevin McCarthy, after publicly humiliating himself to regain Trump's favor, ultimately found that loyalty offered no protection when circumstances changed. Now, that same dynamic appears to be unfolding within Trump's business network. Accountants, attorneys, and bankers associated with the organization are reportedly scrambling to distance themselves and in some cases cooperate with investigators. The pattern is familiar. Loyalty is rewarded only until legality becomes an obstacle. Put yourself in their shoes for a moment, the ship is sinking, and the feds are at the door. Do you go down with the captain or grab a life vest? Tell me what you'd really do. Prosecutors trace the current action to what they describe as a decades-long fraud scheme documented in hundreds of pages of filings. Inflated valuations appeared across marquee assets, from Trump Tower to golf resorts to his personal residence. Deutsche Bank, long Trump's primary lender, ultimately cooperated after internal communications surfaced, suggesting executives were aware the numbers were implausible but approved loans because of the fees involved. Those revelations alone could have serious consequences for financial professionals who knowingly facilitated deception. Trump's initial reaction followed a well-worn script: denunciations, accusations of political witch hunts, and vows of total victory. But behind closed doors, the situation deteriorated rapidly. Reports describe frantic meetings, collapsing cash flow, and growing anxiety among donors and executives. When Trump refused to consider compromise and instead challenged the court's authority outright, asserting sweeping immunity and attacking the judge personally, he appears to have sealed his fate. In her order, Judge Chen cited his refusal to accept accountability and his attempts to undermine the process as evidence that he could not be trusted with continued control. The receiver now in charge faces an immense task. She has broad authority to approve transactions, restructure operations, sell assets, and report regularly to the court. Trump is legally barred from interfering. Any attempt to do so could result in contempt charges. Employees are divided between personal loyalty to Trump and relief at the arrival of professional oversight. Navigating that internal fracture while stabilizing the business will be critical in the coming weeks. Politically, the consequences are already rippling outward. Trump's brand has always rested on strength, dominance, and success. Images of court-appointed officials taking control of his headquarters tell a very different story. For donors, party leaders, and voters who prized his business credentials, the loss of control due to fraud findings is uniquely damaging. It cannot be reframed as a clever strategy or a temporary setback. Within the Republican Party, the ruling intensifies long, simmering tensions. Some see an opportunity to move on from Trump without openly repudiating his supporters. Others double down, convinced this is proof of a vast conspiracy. Major donors have begun withdrawing support, openly questioning whether someone stripped of his business for fraud can credibly claim to manage the nation's economy. Now, let us shift our simulation to Capitol Hill, where another crisis of authority is unfolding. Imagining a Senate hearing where the topic pivots to foreign policy. Let's begin with Venezuela and the bipartisan effort aimed at limiting the president's authority to escalate United States military involvement there. Addressing the senator from Kentucky, let us start with you. You were one of only a handful of Republicans who initially voted to move this resolution forward. Yet, after the president publicly warned that lawmakers supporting it should never be re-elected, 2 of your colleagues reversed course, killing the measure. Why do you believe that happened? The issue at stake goes far beyond Venezuela. This debate reaches back to the founding of the Republic. During the Constitutional Convention and throughout the Federalist Papers, thinkers across the ideological spectrum agreed on one essential point. The decision to initiate war is too consequential to rest in the hands of a single individual. That authority was deliberately placed with Congress. This matters not only because of what may still unfold in Venezuela, but because of what comes next. If such unilateral action were normalized there, it becomes a precedent for Greenland, for Cuba, for Colombia, for Iran, and for other countries the president has openly threatened. Under the Constitution, those decisions do not belong to the president alone. They belong to Congress. History shows how this is supposed to work. When the United States has truly been attacked, Congress has acted decisively and nearly unanimously, after Pearl Harbor, after September 11th. That unity is the product of debate, transparency, and constitutional process. Turning to the senator from Virginia in this hypothetical exchange, some of your Republican colleagues say they withdrew their support after receiving assurances from the administration that there were no ground troops in Venezuela and that Congress would be consulted before any major escalation. Do you trust those assurances? Frankly, no. Public promises are better than silence, and they can be enforced politically. But this episode revealed something important. Even though the resolution ultimately failed, it had real impact. Within hours of the initial bipartisan vote, the president announced that a second invasion of Venezuela had been called off. Shortly after that, commitments were made that no ground troops would be deployed without congressional authorization. Equally significant, this entire military effort had been conducted in secrecy. The administration refused to hold even a single public hearing. That has now changed. The Secretary of State has agreed to testify before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. That allows Congress to ask essential questions. Why does the Maduro regime remain in power? What is the end goal? How long will the United States stay involved? When will Venezuelans be allowed to hold free elections? Bipartisan pressure altered the administration's behavior. That tells us something important. When Congress acts together, it can force transparency and restraint. That is why more action, not less, is warranted. This is a critical point about war powers. Do you trust Congress to make these decisions, or is the president the only one who can act fast enough? Hit the like button if you think the Constitution still matters. This brings us to Greenland. Lawmakers in both parties have warned that the president's threats risk fracturing NATO itself. Is there growing urgency in the Senate to introduce another war powers resolution specific to Greenland? There are several possible paths forward. One is exactly that, a new war powers resolution. That option is actively being discussed, and once filed, it would guarantee a vote. A second path concerns trade. The president has announced new tariffs targeting European allies, explicitly tying them to pressure over Greenland. Congress has the authority to challenge those tariffs, and bipartisan efforts to do so are already taking shape, just as similar challenges have occurred in the past. The third option involves NATO directly. Under current United States law, a president cannot withdraw from or suspend participation in NATO without congressional approval. That statute is directly implicated by the president's rhetoric. Across party lines, there is growing concern that reckless language and threats are undermining alliances rather than strengthening them. Pushing allies away weakens American security. Senator from Kentucky, do you believe there are enough Republicans to support legislation limiting tariffs or preventing military action related to Greenland? On military action, there is virtually no Republican support for invading Greenland. Even the most hawkish members have privately rejected that idea. The president continues to float it rhetorically, but it has no real backing. As for purchasing Greenland, threatening and berating potential partners is not how negotiations succeed. That approach is unlikely to work. Unlikely on tariffs and emergency powers, this issue is already before the Supreme Court. Declaring an emergency does not erase the Constitution. Taxing authority originates in Congress, not with presidential decree. The idea that a president can unilaterally impose sweeping tariffs simply by declaring an emergency is constitutionally unsound. The administration points to a statute intended for international economic emergencies, but it was never designed to authorize broad trade wars. The courts are likely to strike this down, and when they do, it will represent a meaningful check on unchecked executive power. The longer this continues, the more damage is done. Let me follow up on that. A Republican congressman has suggested impeachment if the president were to take military action against Greenland. You defended the president during prior impeachment proceedings. Would annexation rise to that level? Finally, let us consider the verdict on power, remembering that constitutional disputes occur all the time and are often resolved by the courts. Disagreement over interpretation does not automatically equate to impeachable conduct. Congress has a responsibility to debate, to constrain, and to balance presidential power, but impeachment should be rare and extraordinary. Past impeachments were deeply partisan and damaging to the country. Elections, not constant impeachment threats, are the appropriate remedy in most cases. That said, Congress cannot wait until after military action occurs. The argument that something only becomes a war once casualties mount is absurd. Congress is supposed to decide before lives are lost. Presidents of both parties have tried to redefine military actions as something less than war, kinetic operations, enforcement actions, or blockades. But a full naval blockade and seizure of resources are acts of war. Congress must reclaim its role. This is not theoretical. American sons and daughters would be sent into these conflicts. They deserve to know that the country debated the decision and stood behind it. Zooming out, this entire conversation is about bipartisan governance. Senator from Virginia, you faced criticism within your own party for working with Republicans to keep the government funded. Do you believe more lawmakers need to cross the aisle to break the gridlock frustrating so many Americans? Absolutely. I learned governing in an environment where compromise was necessary to accomplish anything. That lesson still applies. Working across the aisle is not a weakness. It is how democracy functions. If voters want more cooperation, they should demand it. Ask elected officials what they are doing with someone from the other party. Encouragement from constituents matters more than people realize. Senator from Kentucky, last word. What does it take to find common ground? When one party controls government, restraint must come from within that party. My positions haven't changed under different presidents. Emergency powers should be rare and temporary. Declaring endless emergencies to justify permanent power grabs undermines constitutional order. There is no emergency with Greenland. Declaring emergencies to prevent hypothetical emergencies leads to perpetual crisis governance. That is where we are now. Tariff emergencies involving more than 100 countries. That defies common sense. Regardless of party, Congress must reassert its authority. That is how checks and balances survive. Thank you both. And that brings us to the broader picture. The United States now finds itself in a widening diplomatic confrontation with NATO allies over Greenland. The European Union is openly weighing retaliation after the president threatened new tariffs unless Greenland is sold to the United States. The proposed tariffs would begin next month and escalate sharply by summer. Denmark and Greenland have made their position unmistakably clear. The territory is not for sale. Protests in both places reflected that message, with demonstrators rejecting American pressure outright. The administration argues that Greenland is essential to national security, citing missile defense, Arctic competition, and long-term strategic positioning. Critics respond that coercive tariffs against allies weaken rather than protect United States security. Buying Greenland? It sounds like a joke, but in this timeline, it's almost reality. Are we watching a dark comedy or a geopolitical tragedy? Comment comedy or tragedy below. I want to know how you see this. European leaders have warned that such measures violate basic principles of sovereignty and risk triggering a dangerous cycle of retaliation. Emergency meetings are already underway, with options ranging from counter tariffs to unprecedented restrictions on American companies operating in Europe. Economists warn that consumers would feel the impact quickly. Higher prices on medicine, auto parts, food, and industrial goods. Markets already sensitive to uncertainty are reacting accordingly. Meanwhile, lawmakers in Washington remain divided. Some frame the effort as historical expansionism. Others call it a reckless land grab. Even within the president's own party, dissent is growing. As this unfolds, the consequences extend beyond diplomacy. They touch the economy, constitutional limits, alliance structures, and America's standing in the world. And while global tensions rise, the country also faces domestic strain. From severe winter storms affecting tens of millions to escalating protests over immigration enforcement to extraordinary discussions about invoking laws meant for national insurrection. All of it raises the same fundamental question: who decides how power is used and whether the guardrails of democracy still hold? Deepening this hypothetical scenario, we must now turn our lens inward to the fracturing of the domestic landscape where the abstract clashes of international diplomacy collide with the concrete reality of American daily life. As the fictional winter turns to a volatile spring, the standoff over Greenland and the corporate seizure in New York begin to merge into a singular crisis of legitimacy. In this projection, governors from 4 major states, representing diverse political coalitions, have formed an unprecedented compact to challenge the federal implementation of the new emergency tariffs. Citing the 10th Amendment and the imminent economic harm to their local manufacturing sectors, they have instructed state commerce departments to effectively pause the collection of these federal levies at key ports of entry. This act of soft nullification creates a legal gray zone that Washington has not seen since the mid-19th century, forcing the administration into a corner. Either federalize the National Guard to enforce tax collection against the will of local populations, or allow federal authority to evaporate in real time. Simultaneously, the media ecosystem in this dramatization has ceased to function as a shared public square, bifurcating into 2 hermetically sealed realities that no longer share a common language. On one side, the court-appointed receiver for the Trump Organization has begun the methodical process of liquidating assets to satisfy outstanding judgments. We see images of logos being removed from golf courses and iconic buildings being rebranded under new management groups. To half the country, this is the restoration of the rule of law, a visible proof that accountability is finally knocking at the door of power. But to the other half, fueled by a shadow campaign of alternative information, these same images are broadcast as evidence of a deep state coup. In this counter-narrative, the properties were not seized for fraud, but stolen by political enemies. The former president, despite being legally barred from operations, continues to hold rallies at properties he no longer owns, claiming that the receiver is merely a squatter and that he remains the true chairman in exile. This creates a surreal duality where tenants pay rent to a court official while attending rallies where they are told the court official does not exist. If you lived in this building, who would you pay? The court or the chairman in exile? It's a tough choice when reality splits in two. Tell me your move in the comments. The tension reaches its zenith as the timeline approaches the party conventions. The question of eligibility becomes the new battleground. Legal scholars argue that the fraud rulings and the defiance of court orders constitute high crimes that disqualify a candidate from office, yet the political base remains mobilized, viewing the legal disqualification as the ultimate badge of honor. A chaotic scenario emerges, where state secretaries of state begin issuing conflicting rulings on ballot access. In 3 swing states, the name of the leading opposition candidate is removed from the ballot, while in 3 others, legislatures threaten to decertify any election result that does not include him. The Supreme Court, already strained by the Greenland and tariff cases, now faces the impossible task of adjudicating the mechanics of democracy itself, knowing that any ruling they issue will be rejected by at least 40% of the population as illegitimate. Ultimately, this extended simulation leaves us staring into the abyss of a constitutional paradox. The system was designed with checks and balances to prevent tyranny, but it was also designed with the assumption of good faith actors who would eventually bow to the finality of a court order or an election result. When that assumption is removed, when the loser of a lawsuit simply declares the judge a fraud and the loser of an election declares the voting machines rigged, the machinery of government grinds to a halt. The final image of this drama is not one of explosion, but of paralysis, a government that can command the military to circle Greenland, but cannot pave its own roads or pass a budget because the basic agreement on who is in charge has dissolved. The guardrails of democracy, it turns out, are only as strong as the people willing to hold on to them, and in this moment, everyone seems to be letting go. We've painted a picture of total paralysis. So, what is your exit strategy? If the system stops working tomorrow, what do you do? Share your survival plan below, and don't forget to subscribe for the next what if scenario.